Some time ago, we looked at Justice League Task Force for the Sega Genesis, a fighting game where you could play as 9 assorted DC comic superheroes and supervillains in a rather subpar fashion. That game also saw a release on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and that's the version we're looking at today. This is Justice League Task Force for the SNES, released in 1995, courtesy of Sunsoft, Acclaim, and Blizzard. Justice League Task Force has 3 modes of play. There's the story mode where you take control of one of the 6 Justice League members who has to fight Darkseid, his 2 minions, and various robot clones of the other Justice League members you didn't take, in a weak attempt to explain why these heroes are fighting each other in this game. You also have the battle mode, which lets you play as any of the 9 fighters in a traditional arcade mode format. I assume you people know what an arcade mode is. It's in various fighting games, except for some of the recent ones, I guess. And finally, there's the traditional 2-player versus mode, where you can have loads of fun with a second player, if you could find one. Justice League Task Force is a rather basic fighting game sporting the typical 6-button control setup with 3 punch buttons and 3 kick buttons. Each of the 9 superpowers has a variety of special moves that can be performed with your traditional Street Fighter-esque commands, your quarter circles, half circles, charge moves, that sort of thing. It's a fairly basic setup though, no super moves or anything crazy like that. You just beat the crap out of each other and whoever's left standing wins. It's pretty no frills in that regard, and that makes it fairly uncomplicated to get into. Controlling Justice League Task Force is actually pretty smooth for the most part. The response time in regards to inputting commands is pretty decent, which is somewhat surprising considering how control on the Genesis version of Justice League Task Force was something of a farce. Here I could manage several fireballs in a row without much of a hitch. On the other version, I'd be lucky to pull off 2 or 3 in a row, or even every once in a while. It's amazing, actually, that I went into this expecting a rather shoddy job of a fighter after the subpar Mega Drive version, and I come out of this one quite impressed. For about 5 seconds, that is. Because while you're able to get better controls out of Justice League on the SNES side of things, that's not really saying a whole lot because gameplay in general is a bit on the underwhelming side. Mind you, a basic Street Fighter 2 knockoff that is competently executed is nothing to sneeze at, especially during those days when fighting games were still in their infancy, and in that regard alone it's alright at best. But as a fighting game featuring superheroes and supervillains with these spectacular powers and abilities, Justice League is just unremarkable. And an unremarkable fighting game is something of a disservice to these characters who should be fun to play with but really aren't, because the moves they have to work with are rather lame. I mean, look, I'm not expecting X-Men Children of the Atom caliber material here. If that were even remotely possible, the SNES would have gotten that game instead of the lesser Mutant Apocalypse game. But even so, the possibility of a fun superhero game with crazy powers to play with is within reach on the hardware. Why does the Thunder Megazord in that Power Rangers Fighting Edition have that awesome lightning attack? Or why is Donatello capable of summoning a huge-ass dragon in that Tournament Fighters game? And yet Superman has a pea shooter that the game shamelessly calls Heat Vision. Jesus Christ, I mean, look, Super Nintendo could do lasers. They do lasers all the time. I mean, look, lasers. Okay, moving on. Justice League feels so generic and so interchangeable that you could replace the names and the bodies with totally different and original characters do not steal. There wouldn't be much of a difference to notice, but at the very least, it is a competent fighter. Controls work the way they're supposed to most of the time. The combat in general is fairly solid enough. The AI may be somewhat considered either a bit overwhelming or a bit cheap, depending on your point of view. Though with slightly improved response on this version of the game, you might fare a bit better, which says very little about the game itself. If nothing else, at least 2-player games are somewhat fun, for a short while at least. In terms of presentation, Justice League Task Force falters somewhat, at least on the Super Nintendo. The story mode's cutscenes comprise your character's winning pose over some generic block of text as opposed to the Genesis version's more colorful and visually more interesting intermissions. The heads-up display comes off as a bit cheap looking. That cool intro from the Mega Drive version with the Darkseid voiceover.
I control the technology. I have the power.
Yeah, that's not in there. The lesser presentation doesn't kill the game outright, not when there isn't much to kill to begin with, but comparing the 2 games, it's easy to tell at first glance which version looks like some effort was put into it, which version looks like an afterthought tossed together in 5 seconds. and then you actually play the two versions and realize the opposite is true, so I don't know. Setting that piece of business aside, however, the actual game bits aren't too bad looking. The various stage backdrops are well rendered and popping with color, even if some of them feel a bit barren. The characters are detailed and popping with color, even if animation is lacking in some regards. In some respects, I rather like the stages found in this version. Green Arrow's forest level, for example, is a nice suitable level than the park he had in the Mega Drive version, and Darkseid's home stage is a nice gloomy place befitting a final battle between gods, rather than the hangar bay of some spaceship somewhere on the other version. However, points must be docked for the incredibly lame explosion that your hero clones suffer when defeated. Yeah, that's definitely worthy of a triumphant fanfare, which you don't get in this game. You get this lamer bit. But I will say this, sound is one thing I'll give props to the SNES version of Justice League because it's actually better than what you get on the Genesis version of the same game. The Genesis version might have the better intro, but the audio quality in that game is comparable to shooting a cap gun directly into your eardrums, which I would not recommend because it's not only painful, but it could affect your hearing, and it's incredibly stupid. On the Super Nintendo side of things, while sound quality is a little better, that's not really saying a whole lot because what sound is here is still very much a mediocre lot. No Darkseid intro means no Darkseid voiceovers, and the only remaining voiceovers are generic grunts which sound lame. Sound effects are adequate and not much else. Then there's the music of Justice League Task Force, where the only standout is really this ambient track that plays during Green Arrow's stage. The rest of the tunes, at the very least, sounds like some semblance of music for the most part, but none of it is memorable, none of it is excitable or I guess epic sounding as the cool kids call it, and pretty much all of it is dull. Except for Green Arrow's theme. That's peaceful. An almost relaxing ambient piece of music. Yeah, I could fall asleep listening to this piece, but I gotta finish this off. Overall, to say that Justice League Task Force on the Super Nintendo is a touch better than its Genesis counterpart is akin to saying that an irritable colon is a touch better than straight up bowel cancer. At the very least, this one controls a little better and feels like a somewhat competently produced fighting game that's generic but otherwise not completely worthless. It's certainly nowhere near the depths of ineptitude that games like Street Combat or Ultraman reside in, so for what it's worth, if you just want a competent little fighter, then Justice League on the Super NES fulfills that just fine. But if you want a really awesome superhero game where you can go batshit crazy with all of them superpowers, then you're better off looking elsewhere for that particular fix because Justice League's Task Force, regardless of what console it's on, doesn't come close to satisfying that particular need.